Terry, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, it's always great to be here, Nick.
Well, I want to start off with the legislative session. The lawmakers are back in; at least half of them are
Right.
back in today. How would you rate, I guess, so far the work of the General Assembly?
Well, it's easy, and you hear a lot about that. It's easy to talk about what's not happening. We actually, when it comes to kids and families, feel really good about what's happening. The one thing that echoed last session that you and I talked about at the end of last session, which is happening again this session, is we are really finding bipartisan support for the same measures. And what I think is an underrated success in Frankfurt is that folks who may not agree ideologically on a lot of other issues seem to be able to come together when it comes to kids. So whether it's a child abuse effort that we're making, the dating violence effort that has gotten a lot of publicity, issues around early childhood, we're finding leaders in the House and leaders in the Senate who are sponsoring really parallel bills. We also have gotten very affirmative feedback from leadership in both chambers around those efforts. So I may be the lone voice who is saying that we appreciate the fact that if we know that Frankfurt is bifurcated, if we know that on issues of minimum wage and prevailing wage, if we know that on those kind of issues of tax reform, that there's toxicity and polarization, I find it really encouraging and refreshing that there's middle ground when it comes to kids and families.
And I think that's really an interesting aspect here. Here we have something like the dating violence bill, for instance, which, you think of a dating violence bill, and I think a lot of people, myself included, my first thought doesn't jump to how does this affect Kentucky youth? But it really does, doesn't it?
Well, the dating violence bill, and again, what a great example that Representative Tilley and Senator Westerfield, who I think it's okay with them. I think of them as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid because it seems like, last year was this huge juvenile justice reform. This year they've stepped up again on this. And you're exactly right. It affects really two very different groups of children. We know that young children witness violence when those kind of tragedies happen in their home. And we know that the research is very clear that not just child abuse, but if a child is exposed to violence, if they see violence, it has such an impact on them really for years to come. So we certainly think that the dating violence bill helps those young kids. The area that I think really oddly has not been talked about as much is the idea of what happens to adolescents, whether they're in high school or on college campuses. We recently had a Children's Advocacy Day, and the night before, I got to work with about 100 kids from Eastern Kentucky who were coming to Frankfurt the next day, and we went over issues. It was pretty stunning when I asked how many of them had been affected by dating violence or how many of them had a close friend who had. Most hands went up, and I don't believe it was a hype. I don't believe it was an exaggeration. The other thing, when we talk to leaders on university campuses, we have a board member who is a senior administrator at Western, and he talks a lot about the impact that this bill would have positively on creating a safer environment for folks on university campuses. So whether it's that 5-year-old in a home who has seen his or her mom be a victim, or whether it's adolescents in late high school or early college themselves, that dating violence bill is very much a kid-friendly piece of legislation.
And I think that's interesting. We talk a lot about the teachers, especially in the media, about, what can the teachers do to improve the classroom? How can we get more people learning? What can those types of things. But a lot of this, it sounds like it's incumbent on the parents and their own personal relationships and how much time they can offer.
Right. Well, on the dating violence, it's certainly we need to be able to create an environment where all folks are safe. You mentioned teachers and safety. Another area that we're working on really hard, probably if there is a bill that we at KYA are most focused on, It's the idea of ensuring that every educator receives ongoing education when it comes to identifying child abuse. If there is an issue that the General Assembly gets an A+ on over the last few years, I believe it's child abuse. You think about that they added transparency to the external fatality review panel for journalists, frankly, and also for the general public. This last session, they funded it adequately for the first time. One of the things that the General Assembly did a couple sessions ago was passed a broad mandate for all kinds of folks who work with kids to receive education about identifying child abuse. Early childhood folks, a number of folks. Interestingly, the two groups that were exempted were medical professionals and the K-12 community. Last year, as part of the Face It campaign, which is led by Kozakiewicz Charities, it's really a Louisville, or it began in Louisville, but it really has spread throughout the state. So Kozakiewicz Charities is really the voice on proactive legislation when it comes to child abuse. Last year, Kozakiewicz Charities, working with Representatives Westrom and Wuchner, again, bipartisan group, and Senator Denton, so again, both chambers involved, passed really important legislation that required medical professionals to receive training around identifying the signs of child abuse, especially head trauma. We knew that one of the things the child fatality panel had discovered was that over 50% of children who died from abuse had been in a medical home 2 weeks prior to their death. So it meant that medical professionals might have seen the signs. They noticed the bruise behind the ear. They didn't connect the dots. We've gotten great feedback from doctors and nurses about, we are so glad that we're having that training provided. So that leaves one group that doesn't have any mandates around that, and that's educators. We've been really appreciative that the School Board Association, that superintendents, that teacher unions have agreed that educators, coaches, instructional assistants in the classroom, we really need to get them education.
Well, how do you give that education, though? Where do you look for those points? Is it on one of these broad training days for teachers that you say, you have to do 6 hours of training? How does that work?
I think the folks who have put the legislation together, and Representative Rita Smart and newly elected Senator Julie Rocky Adams are who gets the credit, along with Kozakiewicz Charities, on this. The plan that is being proposed would have the Kentucky State Board of Education approve a fairly broad list of high-quality options. So, for instance, one of those is currently the Kentucky Department of Education has online training around child abuse that folks who know a lot more about it than I do have looked at, meets the quality standard. So it could be that, and then what happens is, after the state board approves these options, local school districts make the choice. So again, that local control is there. So one district may say that they want their employees to get trained by doing this online module. Another might look for a much broader type training. So what we want to make sure of is really a couple things. One is that any education program that's offered is high quality. We want it to meet its goal. Secondly, we do understand that local options are really important for school districts. The proposal that's on the table right now, and that bill has passed judiciary in the Senate, so we're waiting for a vote. It's been Representative Smart's bill, which is a mirror of Senator Rocky Adams, sits in House Education. It really talks about that new employees get this training relatively soon, maybe during the first semester of employment. That once you've gone through that, if I'm an existing teacher or principal or coach, I receive it every other year. So it's not, I don't believe it's an intrusive requirement. In a lot of ways, what we've heard from educators, which again I think is a compliment to educators, is they welcome it. Every teacher, like you, like me, like every viewer, is by law a mandated reporter. So, Kentucky is not Pennsylvania. We don't have Penn States here. If you suspect something, you as a citizen are required to report it. Well, we know that there's not a profession that sees more kids than educators.
Right,
If
right.
today is a typical day in Kentucky, 49 kids will have been abused. Over half them are school-age kids. So as educators become more familiar with, again, connecting dots, they pick up a physical sign, they hear a comment, it clicks. We believe that this is a really important step in stemming that tide of child abuse.
All right, Terry. Well, a lot of top priority pieces out there. There's still about 15 days, 16 days left of this legislative session, so we'll be sure to watch and see what happens there.
All right, well, we are looking for that bipartisan support to make a difference for kids. And thanks for giving kids a spotlight, Nick.